Endure now and reap your reward. Brother Kenneth Williams, Circuit Overseer, February 12, 2009. Asheville, Alabama. Kingdom Hall. You and I, we face so much right now. It's just like Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 1. He said, "But know this, that in the last days critical times hard to deal with will be here." Another Bible says that Paul said to Timothy, "You might as well know that in the last days it is going to be hard to be a Christian." The focus is on the word, hard. That's where we are right now. These are hard, difficult times. This quality of endurance is so very important for you and I. Thinking about that, the Greek word for endurance means to remain or to stay under. It can also mean to stand one's ground, to persevere, to remain steadfast. Thus the word is translated, endure. The noun usually denotes one who is courageous and steadfast, one that is patient. The one that has this type of endurance, they won't give up hope in the face of obstacles, persecution, discouragement, and even trials. These individuals just continue to plow the way. Here's a question for you. Why does the Bible say that you and I must possess this quality of endurance? Here's something to think about that we just had in our Bible study a few weeks ago. We talked about living in expectation of Jehovah. In talking about that, we found it meant living right now in expectation of his day. When we really think about that statement, when that day finally gets here, it is not going to matter what we have or don't have. It's not going to matter who is mad with us or whether we're mad with them. It's not going to matter what disagreements we have. None of that is going to matter. The only thing that's going to matter is our relationship with Jehovah God. The quality of endurance will help us in that regard. There's even more as to why we need this quality of endurance. Think about this. Isn't it true that you and I face much indifference when it comes to the message that we bear? Many of you work jobs, some of you young ones go to school, and people say, "You're such a nice person, you just so likable. What church do you go to?" You say, "I go to the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses." And they say, "Oh, you're one of them." They disdain in some cases the love we have for our God Jehovah and the way of life that he would have us to live. People love the way we act, but when they find out why we act the way we do, it causes us to have to endure that as well. Isn't it true, too, that in many cases we have family members who have a disdain for the God we love with all of our hearts? There are some of us here that are the only ones in our family that are in the truth. We would hope that other members would see things Jehovah's way, but they haven't. We continue to persevere, we continue to endure without them serving our great God Jehovah. My grandmother told my mother, who was an only child, that if she became one of them, I'll disown you. Her only child. My mother got baptized anyway. About 6 months later, my grandmother wrote her a letter and said, "You could have done worse. If that's what you want to do, that's fine. You are not mistreating the children." That is what some of us have to endure. There's more things, too, friends. Isn't it true that at this very moment there are those of us in the audience who are aching to the very bone with different physical maladies? It could be that some of us found out just today that we have a condition that is going to be difficult to live with for the rest of our days. Maybe no one knows except us and Jehovah. We haven't even had the chance to tell our family, but yet we endure that too. We're here in Jehovah's house. There's one other thing that we might have to endure. There may be those of us who are struggling with depression, emotional illnesses, things that we wouldn't want anyone else to have. It could be that we have a loved one who has left Jehovah. We want them to come back and serve him with all our heart, but they haven't. We endure the loss, we accept the pain, and continue to serve our great God Jehovah. Without this essential quality of endurance, not one of us could come into possession of everlasting life. Notice what the Apostle Paul said at Hebrews chapter 10. Normally when we go to Hebrews chapter 10, what are we talking about? We're usually talking about meeting attendance. We won't talk about it quite as much tonight, just a little bit. Notice what Paul said in verse 36 of Hebrews chapter 10. "For you have need of endurance, in order that, after you have done the will of God, you may receive the fulfillment of the promise." Why was it that these Jews in Jerusalem had this need for endurance? Look up at verse 34, where it gives us some indication. "For you both expressed sympathy for those in prison and joyfully took the plundering of your belongings, knowing you yourselves have a better and an abiding possession." Think about that. These individuals who were serving Jehovah were under persecution themselves. Imagine if this was you. You came home from work today and you saw the authorities pulling all of your belongings out of your home and you just rode past your house and you had nowhere else to go, so you came here to the Kingdom Hall. One of the elders met you at the door and asked if you were okay. You say, "They're ripping my house apart. They are plundering my possessions." The elder tells you, "I've been here since noon. They tore my house up this morning." What can the both of you do for each other? That goes back to Hebrews 10:24 and 25. "And let us consider one another to incite to love and fine works, not forsaking the gathering of ourselves together, as some have the custom, but encouraging one another, and all the more so as you behold the day drawing near." You can incite one another to love and notice, to fine works. The fine works is the reason for this building. It is the reason for every Kingdom Hall. As a sidebar, we enjoy our worship to Jehovah, but the whole purpose of this building is so that we can engage in the preaching work. We can organize and teach others about Jehovah's truths. It's interesting that in verse 36, one Bible scholar explains that the Greek word that Paul used there for endurance describes the ability of a plant to live under unfavorable circumstances. Believe it or not, there is one such plant. This plant thrives at 20 to 30 degrees below zero. When everything else has shriveled and withered, it's just like it's having a spring day. It lives in the frigid mountains of Europe. You would never guess the name of the plant. It is called the live forever plant. So, here the Bible scholar was giving us some indication to what Paul meant when he told those Jews, and by extension us, what was needed in the quality of endurance. In Luke 21 and verse 19 it states, "By endurance on your part you will acquire your souls." The footnote mentions your future lives. You see, friends, he lived with eternity in view. Our problems may be difficult now, they may even be great, but we're focused on living for thousands of years. Sometimes when we drive in the ministry and we notice the big churches, wow, that's going to be the biggest bathroom. Ezra says that they are going to be public privies, right, just large bathrooms. I see all of the landscaping and I think about how soon that will be inhabited by the meek one of the earth. That's the thinking we have. This will help us to endure. It is not how we start that counts in the race for life, but it is the finish. Do we still have those diamond-like qualities that we had when we first learned the truth? Do you remember when you first learned the truth and you wanted to tell everybody? You went to your relatives' homes. What has happened to those mini blinds that they had up there, or the shades? They come down now when they see you coming, don't they? They know that you are coming to talk to them about the truth. You want them to accept it so bad. Do we still have that same zeal? Are we living with that same urgency in mind? Are we still freely giving when it comes to teaching all that Christ commanded? When we think about that, Jesus said at Matthew 24 verse 13, "But he that has endured to the end is the one that will be saved." That being said, there are some of us that the only thing we can do is endure to the end. That is our assignment, to endure to the end of this system of things. On the contrary, persons who quickly accept the word of God on the surface, they will lack endurance. Trials and tribulations may come their way, but they have nothing to prevent them from giving into despair and losing out on Jehovah's blessings and approval. It reminds us of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13 verses 20 and 21 when he talked about the 4 different types of soil. As for the one sown upon the rocky places, this is the one hearing the word and at once accepting it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself but continues for a time, and after tribulation or persecution has arisen on account of the word he is at once stumbled. There was one seedling that fell on the rocky soil beside the road. Remember when that old bird came by? He could pluck it with no hesitation. When I was a young boy in North Carolina, around about the end of March or the 1st of April, depending upon how the year would fall, my father carried out his old tradition. We would plant a large garden every year. He would stand where the garden was last year and look out and say, "This year we are going to plant 4 rows of corn right there." I'd look at him and I'd say, "This year we're going to plant 4 rows of corn right there." I would mimic everything that he said. That's what we did. We planted the 4 rows of corn. While we were planting the 4 rows of corn, I looked up in this big old oak tree over here and there were 5 of the fattest crows you ever wanted to see. My father said as I looked up at him, "Don't worry about them. We're going to plant the corn thick enough that even if they get some of it, they won't get all of it." Sure enough, the rains came and the corn grew. I went down to check on the garden one day and I saw those 5 crows walking like humans and they were just plucking the sprouts out of the ground. But, guess what? As my father said, they couldn't get it all and we had a nice crop. Here's the point, it goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 13, we don't want to be the one that the crow gets. You know that I'm not talking about the crow but I'm talking about Satan the devil and the system that we're living in now. On the other hand, in that same chapter Jesus talked about the seedling that fell on the fine soil, the fertile soil. It took root and had substance. Many Christians are just like that. Matthew 13:23, as for the one sown upon the fine soil, this is the one hearing the word and getting the sense of it, who really does bear fruit and produces, this one 100-fold, that one 60, the other 30. They endure and persevere. These ones bear fruit with endurance. They continue to proclaim God's message despite hardships, sufferings, even discouragement. You have individuals like that here in your congregation. If we are having some difficulty with regard to this quality of endurance, what can help us with all the things we face today to maintain this fine quality of endurance? The first thing we need to do is look at the biblical examples of those who endured. Servants of God that were true, such as Job, the Apostle Paul, John, Jesus and many others. Remember Rahab. Remember her situation. The 2 spies came and Rahab said to them after she diverted the authorities, she said basically, I know about you too. I know about your nation. I know about your God, Jehovah. Before you crossed the Jordan River there were the nations of Sin and Dog and you folks eliminated them. For about 40 years we didn't hear anything about you folks and now all of a sudden you are back on the screen. The next piece of property on this side of the river is us. I know what you are going to do so I want some protection. I want to serve your God. For her to have that type of courage and to do what they asked her to do, it took not only courage, it took the ability to endure what would come her way. When we look at the examples of such individuals, we want to look not just at what happened to them but the results of what happened. Rahab was mentioned in the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews among those who were faithful to the true God Jehovah. Against the backdrop of eternity, any suffering that we face today is only momentary in light. How can we say that? Look at what the Apostle Paul said at 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Consider with me what Paul said in verse 16 through 18. Here's something to keep in mind. When the Apostle Paul wrote these words he wasn't the youngest of men, in fact he was in the latter part of his life. Notice these words, he says, therefore we do not give up, but even if the man we are outside is wasting away, certainly the man we are inside is being renewed from day to day. For though the tribulation is momentary in light, it works out for us a glory that is of more and more surpassing weight and is everlasting, while we keep our eyes, not on the things seen, but on the things unseen. For the things seen are temporary, but the things unseen are everlasting. With these words, friends, we must remember the temporary nature of trials. Hold fast to the Christian hope which will prevent us from giving in to despair and becoming unfaithful to our great God Jehovah. This is because endurance is not dependent on one's own strength. It is dependent upon what Jehovah gives us, His Word, the Bible, His constant Spirit which comforts us and sustains us in every way. Notice something else Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. You've read this many times but we're going to look at it just a little differently. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. No temptation has taken you except what is common to men. But God is faithful, and He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear, but along with the temptation He will also make the way out in order for you to be able to endure it. There have been many who have thought and even taught that the way out included death. It does not. It does not. Look at the latter part of the verse. It says, a quarter in order for you to be able to endure it. How are you going to endure if you are dead? The way out may include then, or the way of escape may involve learning to trust in Jehovah. We emphasize the word, learning, to trust in Jehovah. In other words, we may not know how to do it right but we learned from our great God Jehovah. As we learned in our Bible study this evening at Isaiah chapter 40 verse 29 it states that, He a quarter, Jehovah, a quarter is giving to the tired one power, and to the one without dynamic energy He makes full might abound. When we think about it, it is Jehovah and His Son Jesus Christ that are cheering for us, each and every one of us, in our way of serving them. Therefore, we must have the proper view of trials knowing that our very lives are dependent upon the quality of endurance. Also, that we have assistance from the Most High. As Christians we shouldn't dread trials and tribulations, resenting them, giving in to complaining, self-pity, or even bitterness. We also want to let endurance have its work complete, letting it run its full course without any unscriptural means of stopping it. There are reasons for that. There are good reasons that when we face trials we need to let them run their course. Here's one reason. Sometimes our weaknesses are exposed, putting us in the position to see things that we have in us that we need to make improvements on. Have you ever gone out to purchase a second-hand car? Maybe it's not too old of a car and you have a salesman in the car with you as you are driving, testing it out. You going about 45 miles per hour and he is talking a millimeter. This is a good car. It runs like a sewing machine. Then you say, well, this is at 45, I need to get the car in passing gear, so you take it out on Interstate 59, and when you get up to about 70 miles per hour you hear some knocking. He's not talking now, but you want to know what the problem is. You look at him and say, what's that noise? Do you know why you want to know? Nobody wants to buy a lemon, do they? They have them in laws now so that one won't buy a car that is not in good shape. No one wants to buy a lemon. Jehovah doesn't want one either. He's given us time, right now, to make adjustments in our thinking, in our attitudes. Here's another way of looking at that. Turn in your Bibles to 1 Peter, chapter 4. Peter was a man who knew about adjustments because he had to make many. How would you feel if you read one of the latest watchtowers and there was a picture of you denying the Christ? Because when Matthew wrote his account in 41 CE, Peter was still around. Everything that Peter had done in that regard he could read. There were many adjustments from Peter's standpoint. But, look at what he said in 1 Peter chapter 4. We're going to consider verse 8. Look at the first 3 words. Above all things a quarter. Did you capture that? A quarter, above all things a quarter. What does that mean to you? Yes, Sister Davidson. To me it means that it is first. Yes, that's the highest. That's the goat. You know the goat always tries to find the highest place. So, first and foremost, Peter said, above all things a quarter. What was he talking about? Look at the rest of the verse. He says, above all things, have intense love for one another a quarter. What did he mean by that? If you have a large print Bible like I have in my hand, you have a footnote reference at the bottom. For the word, intense, it says, outstretched. What did Peter mean by that? Imagine for a moment if Brother Tidwell here, if I asked him to go outside and I went on the roof and I took a rope and handed it down to Brother Tidwell and I said, Brother Tidwell, just hold on to the rope, I'm going to pull you up on top of the roof. Or I walk over to Brother Tidwell and I grasp his hand and I lean back with leverage and I pull him up out of the chair. Which would make more sense? More than likely the latter, right? I'd have more leverage, I'd be closer to him. As tall as Brother Tidwell is, if I went up on the roof and tried to pull him up, I'd probably end up down on the ground, wouldn't I? The fact is that I need to get close to him. Back in North Carolina there was an old pioneer brother, and there isn't any way to say this except to just say it. I couldn't stand him. I couldn't stand him. Even when he breathed it upset me. He was cantankerous, hard to get along with, nobody liked him and I couldn't stand him. I thought about it and said, you know, I can't be that way. He's a pioneer and I'm a pioneer, I'm an elder and he's a ministerial servant, and that's just not right. So, I forced myself to work in field service with him. I forced myself. The first couple of times it was difficult. I still couldn't stand him. But, after that, as I got to know him, I found out that this man was doing just good to be in the truth. I found out his history, his past. Upon working with him a little bit more, I found out that he wasn't half bad at all. As I worked with him a little bit more, I began to like the old fella. In fact, from time to time he'll call me in this assignment and I'm so happy to hear from him because he's a fine brother. When individuals would say that they didn't like him, I would say, no, you just have to get to know him, that's all. Many times when we have difficulties with individuals, with our brothers and sisters, you know what the biggest problem is? We don't know them. We have to get close. That's what Peter was saying. Above all things, have intense love a quarter. In other words, pull close, examine, get to know them. That's intense love. He said something else in that verse, didn't he? Look at what else he says. A quarter, because love covers a multitude of sins. What did he mean by that? A few summers ago I skinned my shin pretty badly and I had a bandage on it. Joan and I were going to an outing. I had on some shorts, so I figured I'd take the bandage off and let the wound get some air because it hurt a lot. Joan said as we were going out the door, "Are you going to go like that?" I said, "Yes, what's wrong?" She said, "That's ugly." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "It doesn't look nice." I said, "Well, okay." I went back and put a bandage on it and I had to agree, it looked much better. It still hurt, but it looked much better. Look at the verse again. Peter said, "A quarter because love covers a multitude of sins." There are some of us that have idiosyncrasies that, let's face it, we're going to carry them as we walk into the new system. Some of us are working hard to change them. We're having difficulty, but we're trying. Because we do have them, it makes it difficult for other individuals to be around us. Granted, the Bible tells us that all of us should work on our personalities. However, if you look at the straw in the other person's eye, remember that more than likely you have a rafter in your own. We all have them. Even when this having been said, when we go through these kind of trials, it builds within us endurance. Sometimes there's a tendency to think highly of our opinion, how we feel about things. Here again, Jehovah has given us an opportunity to work on that. If we feel strongly about something, remember this, that's all it is. It's just a feeling. Keep that in mind, because if we inflict it on others, then we may be affecting their ability to endure. There are other reasons why trials can help us. Trials can teach us the importance of empathy. This is a vital quality for Christian overseers. It is. Here's an example. When one elder who had similar problems spoke with a fellow elder who had a disabled son, the elder stated that he could understand the great effort that the brother made every week in getting his son to the meetings. Wasn't that nice to mention that? After they had this conversation, the brother thanked the elder and he said, "You know, this is the first time that someone has really understood the difficulties that my wife and I are facing." Because the elder had gone through a similar situation, he could understand and sympathize with our dear brother. It helped the brother to endure what difficulties they faced. Here's one other thing that trials can do for us. An important lesson that we learn when we go through trials is to rely fully upon Jehovah. If you ask Brother Williams, "How are you doing, Brother Williams?" "I am fine. Everything's good, the car's running and we have gas, everything's okay." Then Brother Williams goes to the doctor and he tells him that he has something that's going to affect him for the rest of his life. It is going to be hard to deal with. It is not so easy to rely on Brother Williams now. When we go through these trials, it teaches us to trust in our God, Jehovah. Here's one who knew it so well. Turn in your Bibles with me to the book of Psalms, the 55th division. Psalms 55. You've read this before. Verse 22. Here David said, "Throw your burden upon Jehovah himself, and he himself will sustain you. Never will he allow the righteous one to totter." That's an interesting verse, especially the last part. He said, "A quarter never will he allow the righteous one to totter." That word in Hebrew, totter, means to rock back and forth. No doubt when David wrote this, he was thinking about how he had to run from his son, Absalom, and run from King Saul. In the mountainous region of Palestine there were many rocks. No doubt many times David slipped on those rocks and hurt himself. Here he was speaking about Jehovah and throwing one's burdens upon Jehovah. In our walk towards life, in our walk with Jehovah, he will never let us sway, symbolically speaking, in our endeavors to please him and in our course of endurance. When we really think about this and go back and read the context, you will find that David, more than likely, was having a difficult time with someone very close to him when he wrote this. It was Jehovah that sustained him during that time. It is Jehovah's helping hand that aids each and every one of us to keep going today. To help us to understand this just a bit more, many years ago there was a horrific earthquake in the country of Armenia. Several people lost their lives. Many buildings were demolished, including an elementary school. This is where Joe comes in. We'll call him Joe for the sake of a name. Joe had a son in the elementary school. He had promised his son if anything ever happened to him that he would be there for his son. Everybody arrived at the scene where the school was and they began to dig with whatever they could find. Joe didn't have anything to dig with, so he started using his hands. He was only thinking about the promise that he had made to his son. If anything ever happened to him, he was going to be there for his son. As the digging began, Joe thought about and wondered about, how soon will it be that I will find my son? Oftentimes we reflect on what Jehovah said. He promised that he would be there for us. In Proverbs 3 and verse 5 we are instructed to trust in Jehovah with all your heart and do not lean upon your own understanding. There's one reference work that says where the scripture says to trust in Jehovah, it means to relax. Just simply relax. That may seem odd to you, but have you ever made a 911 call and you're talking rapidly? What does the person say? They will say slow down and communicate air. Why do they say that? They can't find out where you are if they can't understand your communication. You have to relax enough to communicate. About a year or so ago, Joan and I were traveling to a congregation and we saw a horrific accident. The car was all mangled and we were looking for the white sheet really and truly. We just knew that someone had lost their life. As we drove by we noticed this man sitting on the curbing and he had a little band-aid on his forehead. He was just sitting there like he was dazed. We continued on to where we were staying and turned the television on. We caught the news and there it was, that accident. The man we saw sitting on the curbing, he was in that car. Do you know why he didn't get hurt? He was drunk as a skunk. They explained that that probably saved his life. Many researchers have found that individuals who are inebriated in many cases, sad to say, may others and take their lives, but whenever there is an impact, one reason why they do so well is that their body is so lucid from the alcohol that they just simply go with the flow. According to Proverbs 3 and verse 5, it says to trust in Jehovah. That means that with all the difficulties we face, it may not seem like it, but the best thing that we can do is relax and lean back on Jehovah and let him handle the difficulty. Getting back to Joe, after the hours of daylight had begun to fade and those who had become tired and crushed in spirit had stopped digging, and out of frustration they said, "There's no one, not one child that could have lived through this." They stopped. They left Joe. They left him all by himself. Joe didn't stop digging, not at all. It reminds us of 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 where it says, we are walking by faith, not by sight. Joe had been digging and moving concrete for 6 hours and he wasn't about to stop now. Why? Because of the promise that he had made to his son. If anything happened to him, that he was going to be there for his son. Whether he found his son living or dead, Joe was going to find his son. This reminds us of Romans 14:8, doesn't it? There it says, for both if we live to Jehovah, and if we die to Jehovah. Therefore both if we live and if we die, we belong to Jehovah. What about Jesus Christ, the Messiah? What did he say in John 11 verse 25? He said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that exercises faith in me, even though he dies, will come to life. There was something else that I didn't mention about Joe. Did I tell you about his injuries? Joe had injuries of his own. When he left his building that he was working in that day, he received a deep laceration right below his shoulder blade. It made it difficult for him even to raise his arms. Yet, here this man had been digging and moving concrete for some 6 hours. What determination he had. There's a better word, what endurance he displayed. What about you here tonight? Many of you from week to week you bring your illnesses, you bring your depressions, your discouragement to Jehovah God on a daily basis. You are here at all of the meetings. Now we only have 2 times of coming to the Kingdom Hall to hear. Many other individuals in the congregation may not know what you personally suffer, but you here to serve the true God Jehovah. You endure. If there are some who are in the audience tonight that are facing such difficulties, may the God of peace be with each and every one of you. Getting back to Joe, as darkness set in, it was about the 10th hour of digging. Joe, if you can imagine this, had dug almost like a crater and he was down in the hole. He wasn't about to stop and you know why, because of the promise he had made to his son. The only strength that Joe could gather was from praying to God as he knew him. What about you and I? We know God's name. We can talk to him daily. We can talk to him often. At 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 17 it tells us, pray incessantly. Now it was about the 12th hour and some of the people who had left Joe some 6 hours ago came back in the area just to see. Believe it or not, there in the dark was Joe still digging all by himself. Most of the people said, my goodness, this man has been overcome with grief. We have to stop him. What about you? Some of you who have come into the truth, your family members said that you have completely lost your mind to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses. That is the way they felt. But you did so anyway. The people went and got the authorities. The authorities came and they looked at Joe's situation. They said, "Yes, he is overcome with grief." One of the policemen got down in the hole with Joe, and as he was about to put his hand on Joe, where Joe was digging, there was a little thump, then there was a noise, then there was a faint voice. Think about that for a moment. If you were Joe, how in the world would you feel then? The voice said, "Please help us. We're here. Help us." Before Joe could do anything else, one of the policemen pulled Joe out of the hole. They set Joe over here on the rock. Everybody who had left Joe earlier, the police rallied together to come back. There were signs of life. The people, with all of their enthusiasm, began to dig all the more so. Shortly thereafter there was a small hole made. Believe it or not, there was a child pulled from the hole. Can you imagine, as the child came up out of the hole, how Joe examined, looked to see, but it wasn't his son. Can you imagine how his heart might have been beating? Can you imagine how your heart would have been beating if you were there under those circumstances? After they pulled the first child out, they pulled another child, and another child, and another child. Before long they pulled 19 children out of that hole. Not one of them belonged to Joe. Can you imagine what that must have been like? What was interesting, as the 19th child was pulled out of the hole, Joe looked back. When he looked back, he reached back and there was a little hand and a little fella. When he came up, he said, "I told you my father would find us." Not only did Joe have the ability to endure this situation, but he had taught his son how to endure. Our Heavenly Father Jehovah has endured all of the things that we've seen in our short lifespan and more. What has he taught us? By means of his organization, by means of his son who is directing us. He's taught us how to endure Satan's system. It is Satan, the devil, that wants us to waver in our faith, to become unfaithful to Jehovah God. Never let that be the case. When Joe had nothing else, he kept his eyes on the things unseen. May we do the same in these critical last moments of this system. Think about it, friends. Why not focus on the invisible things like we mentioned here? Do you see yourself in the new system? I mean, do you really see yourself there? When I see the new system, this is what I see. I see my wife, Joan, and I on a hillside cleaning up the earth. It's a spring day and there is a nice breeze. I see it just as clear as I see you right now. Do you see yourself in the new system? There is a saying, if you can't see yourself there, then more than likely you won't be there. Can you envision yourself in the new system? If you can, with eyes of faith, why not look beyond the sickness and the greed of this old polluted earth and see a paradise? See yourself healthy and happy among caring people. Look beyond the blemishes of both physical and spiritual illnesses and see us free because of the ransom sacrifice of Christ Jesus. Do you see Jehovah? Do you see Jesus Christ? Do you see faithful angels and millions of brothers and sisters at your side? If so, endure now and reap your reward.